We've started this series of talks, and I'd like to first mention the people that helped make the talks possible, especially since some of them are here. We put out a call to our community to ask people if they would be willing to fund our artist talks so we can keep them going, whether or not we receive government funding, and we had a really nice response. So I just get the list of people. I should know it by heart, but I just want to make sure I don't miss anyone. So Kim and Alan Leslie, thank you, and Terry Venture, and Jill Elhert, and Nat Phillips, who isn't here tonight. So thank you for making this possible. We've always found in the past it's been really great experience for both students and the community to hear artists talk about their work, because there's different ways to learn about art. I mean, one is the hands-on practice of doing the artwork yourself, but the other is, looking out in the world and thinking about how other artists do their work and maybe thinking about how that connects with your own practice. So I find it's a really important part of our program. So tonight we have Rick Leong. It's our pleasure to have him. He's a painting teacher at Visa. So some of you might have had him in a class, but I thought this would be a nice way to get to know Rick through his work. And Rick has he did his Bachelor of Fine Arts at ExhibitVic and his MFA at Concordia in Montreal. And he shows at the Parisian Laundry in Montreal, which is a really great space. I once saw your work there, and there's a room in the basement of the Parisian Laundry, and it's almost like a cave. For those of you who haven't been to it, it's a really wonderful gallery space in Montreal, and it's a big warehouse space. It used to be a laundry, and so there's two upstairs spaces, and then there was that downstairs space in the room. It was a group show, and it was really dimly lit.
Yeah, I think it was an old boiler room.
Okay, so it's sort of like against everything we understand about the white cube. So it's a small space with hardly any light, but it was really quite interesting because as a viewer you really engaged in the work in a different way, and I thought it really worked well with your work in that there was that kind of mystery where you don't know exactly what is going on. And I just was reading the article in Galleries West, and I thought this was a really good quote about your work, so I'll just read from that, and it includes a quote from you. So,
okay.
So it says, Rick Leong's extraordinarily complex and compelling landscapes seem to originate in a natural world that is both familiar and strange. Leong's monumental oil paintings are dazzlingly detailed, but ultimately cryptic and unknowable almagaths. And this is you describe your work as a synthesis of inspiration, observation, memory, and imagination. So I thought that was a really good way to describe it, because when you're looking at your work as a viewer, it's part very real and part from the imagination, and it's a really fantastic way to engage the viewers. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Rick. And are you okay with the lights off?
Yes.
You're not scared of the dark?
No.
Okay.
Thank you, Wendy, for inviting me to be here, and thank you for all those other people who made it possible for me to be here. It's a great thing to be able to contribute to art culture. I'd like to begin by maybe talking a little bit about how I got into landscape in the first place. I didn't always do landscapes. When I was just graduating from my BFA at UVic, I was given this book of Japanese paintings, and all the text was in Japanese and Chinese. I couldn't read it at all, but the paintings were absolutely gorgeous. And there was this one painting in particular by Kano Motonobu, a 15th century Japanese artist, whose work just utterly captivated me and seduced me and resonated with me to such a degree that that I just wanted to make work like that. I knew that at that point in looking in that work, that that's what I wanted to do. But I knew that I didn't want to just sort of copy what this other artist was doing, particularly that artist. Rather, I wanted to just join into this great conversation that these artists were having about the landscape through the language of the landscape. And I wasn't sure how I was going to do that. So I took a leap of faith, and I just sort of trusted myself to just do what came naturally and try to work more intuitively. So this is an example of that. So this is this is from my first sort of solo exhibition. This is at Parisian Laundry, so you'll be able to see some in-situ shots of that space. And this is called, that exhibition is called Wonderland. It was from 2008. And this work is called Hustle and Flow. And this is 5 feet by 4 feet, so it's actually about that size. And the process for this work was just standing for the canvas, not knowing what I was going to be doing, just letting the hand and the brush move and be utterly within that moment. And through the process of making that waterfall, it revealed the landscape underneath. It's sort of like following the gesture in the moment, in the arm, sort of revealed the landscape. So it became this dialogue with the painting as I was making it. This is called the Wrong phenomenon. So a large part of my process is to work from memory. I don't like bringing resource material into the studio because then I feel like I'm just transcribing, and there's no room for the unexpected to happen. For me, personally. I know that there's many different ways of working, but so part of this is that, I did the rainbow, and then I was looking at pictures after I made the painting, and I realized that I got the colors wrong. Usually it goes from violet up to red, and then I realized that they're wrong, so it's the wrong phenomenon. But I kept it that way because I felt it was just, it was important in that to use that, to be able to work from memory, and be out in the landscape and be impressed by certain things, and then come back in the studio and just work from what you remember and what impressed you the most. And those, some things are lost, and the things that are lost, you just sort of fill in the blanks of what you imagine should be there, and they're just as valid. I'm very interested in this dialogue between the objective outer realm and the subjective inner realm, and how that interplays into these works of art that couldn't exist in any other sort of form. So part of my work, like this, so this is called Kakuna Matata, and this is also 5 by 4. These are all oil and canvas unless I state otherwise. And so I was reading this book of painting and Chinese landscape painting, and this Chinese artist was describing this painting, this landscape, and he was saying there's like these there's 3 rocks by the river that were sort of looked like 3 old men playing chess. And for me, that like just sprang an image in my mind, and it made me think of it like being able to build these landscapes around these forms that were more deliberate, not sort of like something, but really are those things. They are and, they're both and. So this is around the form of a skull, and it was my first sort of foray into that. But what I found about it was by building these landscapes around all these different forms, I was continually having to face with this dilemma of how to make a landscape out of that form and how it exists as both a landscape and that form. So, you start with these general ideas, they're not overly determinatory, and it's that, again, it comes back to that journey between you and the painting and how it's made and what happens. So it's an inquiry, it's an experiment to see what happens at the end without really knowing. So this sort of developed further into these, this is called the golden carp. This is 5 feet by 14 feet. And it's playing with the idea of this carp coming up from below the surface, existing on the surface, and this is the play of surface. And this is called Vicious Delicious. So it's playing with the idea of making these forms out of negative space as well as positive space. So this is the negative space is like this owl eating this moth that's with just these leaves falling. I often, in an exhibition, I try not to show people everything because once I point it out, that's all they see. So, but I'm pointing it out to you because it's, it's this device that I've used quite a bit in my practice. And
so Rick, do you start off with that vision in your mind? If that's what it's going to be like, or does it happen through the process of painting?
This painting was actually, this particular painting was inspired by the colors I saw in a seagull outside of the subway in Montreal. I was really like a seagull. It had all these tawny grays, it had warm grays and cool grays and golden eyes and black beak, and I thought the seagull was so beautiful, and I was on my way to the studio and I made this painting based on the colors of the seagull. But I didn't really know that that's what this was going to end up being. So it's, how the outer sort of influences and forms the inner work in very unexpected ways. 6 by 6 feet, so close to that size. So I almost never paint, I never paint people and I like to paint on a large scale. This is my comfort zone, 6 feet. And I feel it's like when, looking at viewers within the exhibition, it's like they become the viewers in my landscapes that I create. And in that sense, I like to create this sense of going to a place and recreating a sense of being a familiarity of going to a particular kind of place. So this particular exhibition was based on the idea of going to a body of water. And what you do when you go to a body of water is you walk around the body of water and you view the landscape at different distances. Some things you look up close, some things are farther away. And as you move through the gallery space, it moves from day to night. So it's creating this experience of moving through a landscape and getting that sensation of time passing. And during the day, when things are brighter, the forms are more hidden. And as it gets to be darker and things are more obscure, then your imagination starts projecting more into the landscape and the things become more fantastical. So this is will-o-wisp balls at the edge of night. 6 feet by 8 feet. Firefly disco. Night lights, 6 by 8. So it's just looking at the night sky and seeing continuing that idea of the Gestalt. The Gestalt is the way that our brain orders chaos. So it's how we make sense of letters and numbers and create language, and it's also how we see faces and trees. We're ordering that chaos and something recognizable and orderly. And so when we look at something like that, just clouds, say, and we start seeing shapes in the clouds, it's that phenomenon. So this is a in-situ shot. So what I love about this gallery is that it's concrete floors. So it kind of looks like stone, and then the beams and the rafters are like trees, and then the benches are sort of like fallen trees. So the architecture itself alludes to landscape in my mind.
I'm just wondering about the focus. Does it seem focused?
It could just be a bad picture.
Okay. Well, if anyone, I'm the tech as well, so I don't. Okay.
Okay, so this work was part of my thesis exhibition. Oh, that's funny that I was wondering if that was going to show up. Something I've never tried that. Something I've been here before. Okay, so this work is called Dancing Serpent in Dawn's Quiet. It's from 2006, and I graduated in 2007, my MFA in Concordia. So this was I made this for my thesis exhibition, and then the Museum of Modern Fine Arts in Montreal ended up acquiring it out of that exhibition. And 3 years later, I was approached to be part of the Biennale in Montreal in 2009. And the overarching theme for that Biennale was open source. So the curators that I was involved with, what they did is they chose my painting because paintings that are acquired by museums are often acquired, or theoretically are acquired with tax dollars. So theoretically they belong to people. The reality is they don't actually get that much money from the government, so a lot of it is through private donorship, something we're all probably familiar with. So, but the idea was that it's purchased with tax dollars and it belongs to everyone. These artists for all people and for generations to come. So it fit with their idea of what an open source image would be. It belongs to everyone. So what the curators did, the curators I worked with were Claudio Marzano and Scott Blake. And they hired a composer to compose a soundtrack to the painting. And then they, it was very orchestral, and then they put the composition online. Anybody could download that composition and rework it, reinterpret it, do whatever they wanted to it, and then resubmit it back. And then they curated about 20 tracks of that process and played it on this sort of loop in this room. And the museum didn't want to let the work leave its premises. So they asked me to make 2 new works based on this work. So I made 2 works based on the idea of sound and of this place and these different sort of times. So I'm just going to play really quick at one of the samples of that soundtrack. I was going to play it for... do we have speaker seats?
Yeah, well, just there's sound, it's not super loud. One computer without sound.
You might do this one.
It's not the script, it just see if the sound is turned down.
Well,
Oh, it's not, okay, so did you try it and did it work? So we do
well, you can, I think you can find it on, it's not a big deal.
Okay.
You know what, this is the first time I've actually ever tried putting in the sound. Every
I
time
know I was
do a
excited
talk,
about the last meeting.
you know, every time I do this talk, I'm like, I should actually play the soundtrack.
And you did the sound the highest
And so I'm like, you know, I just did a talk last week, and I'm like, oh, I should
so
play
did
the
you
sound.
press and nothing?
And, yeah. Oh. I don't think it's going to work. It's not a big deal. It's a lovely job.
Oh. Can you do an acoustic version?
No.
No.
The thing is, it was very orchestral, like it was a very classical composer that wrote it. And then what ended up happening, people started making it sort of electronica and sort of, you know, hip-hoppy, and it became really interesting, like just the way it was chopped up and rearranged. And I thought it was such an interesting thing to do, because that's essentially what I was inspired to do by looking at all these this painter, Kana Motonobu, which I should say, he was famous for developing this new kind of painting technique, which combined classical Chinese painting and classical Japanese painting. And so there's a lot of different disparate styles that he combined as sort of a whole, a cohesive whole, which I found really compelling. So that sort of idea of combining these disparate things from all over the place in that way is one of the foundations of my practice. So this work is called A Quiet Melody. So these next 2 paintings are what you'd be looking at while listening to the soundtracks. And 6 foot by 8 foot. And so it's this idea of the trees sort of moving slowly in the wind, sort of dancing silently. And this one's also 6 feet by 8 feet. So they're all 6 feet by 8 feet. And this is called The Hidden Din. And this is I want to try to come up with my own way of creating sound within a work. And so this is the first time I started putting in onomatopoeic sounds. That's a mouthful. I can almost never say that. But so you'd have the sounds of like rocks and caws and all the sounds that animals and birds are making embedded within the bark of the tree. So if you go further back and you have like owls and woodpeckers, and every element of the tree is formed in the shape of this text, of the sound of the birds. That's you get a sense of scale. So I'm just going to skip through these works sort of briefly, but I didn't want to give the impression that I only make work for shows, because a large part of my practice is sort of working towards an exhibition and knowing exactly what that space is, and creating that sort of narrative of a viewer walking through the landscape. That's not all I do. I investigate a lot of stuff in terms of research and development, and I look for things, the sort of events or happenings within nature. So things like a storm unraveling. These are all 6 feet by 6 feet. Or, rain, creating a rainbow. I've always sort of embraced cliche. People would say even just painting itself is cliche in this day and age. And then within that cliche, there's all these other cliches and tropes within particularly landscape painting. But for me, every time we're out in the world and we see a rainbow, we stop and there's a rainbow. It's like impresses us every time. We're like, it's special, it's interesting, it's a phenomenon that happens. So I feel like those are the kinds of things, that's why it's a cliche. We are interested always in those things that are happening in nature. And I feel like by, you try to recreate those things and those elements and trigger those emotions in an earnest way, then it overcomes that aspect of cliche. This is moon shadow. It could be as simple as, the sun bouncing off the moon, creating shadows. The tree of life and death. So this one is 6 feet by 8. In the blossoms, there's all these symbols of death and rebirth, like snakes and butterflies and transformation. And this is actually dedicated to a friend of mine that passed away in Montreal, and he was, he died of a heart attack at 40, so it was quite sudden. And so he was a DJ, and so his name's written in here. And it was all about this sort of process of life and death. And it was actually acquired by the Canada Council Art Bank. So I wrote this big dedication to him on that, and then I feel that that painting is now going to be taken care of. The rise and fall, so the narrative of the water evaporating, becoming cloud, turning into vaporize, turning into rain, falling into the ocean, this cyclical sort of narrative. And really just sort of cementing my sort of visual vocabulary by reiterating things and developing them. And this is like an animal. This is 6 feet by 5, it's about that size. So this is an exhibition called I Am Nature, and it was based, in about 2009, I did a residency in Banff, and it was a thematic residency called The Wanderer, after Caspar David Friedrich's The Wanderer above a sea of mist. And it was this romantic idea of the artist going out into nature and climbing over these mountains and being confronted with the sublime. And it was great. I had a great time. And so this body of work was based on that experience of hiking through those mountains. And this work is called Hush, and it's 6 feet by 6 feet. And I started to use text in the work in a more deliberate way. This is called, written in these branches. Is called. Is written the sound of silence is the sound of self. So it's just this idea of walking through the woods in the middle of nowhere, and the only thing you can hear is the sound of your own footsteps and your own thoughts. Babbling Brook. So this happened very differently than that first waterfall I showed you. It was a thematic residency. There was a group of us, and so we were all familiar with each other's work. And one of the artists would be like, "Oh, we cross a waterfall," and be like, "Well, there's one of Rick's Babbling Brooks." So I wanted to do this work that was made from that moment, that Babbling Brook. But this one, as opposed to the first one, which was just completely in that moment and happened very quickly, this one was like pulling teeth, it took a very long time. This is Rock Pile. And this is a Mystic Crypsis. So this is seeing this, stumbling across this box that was in this state of decomposing into the landscape. It was half box, half landscape. And it made me realize that we all become landscape in one way or another. So I don't know if you could, like, did people see the box in this? I had a girl that worked at the gallery. She could never understand why it was a painted bush. She never saw a fox. She said, "Oh, it's like the bird." So you just never know, like, what people see and what people don't see. So this is floating forest. This is one of my larger works, 60 by 9 feet. So this is the process of hiking up through the tree line, being like you're in the canopy itself and just seeing the landscape from different perspectives. And this is the title work of the show. This is called I Am Nature and So Are You, and it's that's what's written within the work. It says I am nature and so are you. So some are easier to see than others, but what I found is that it creates this active sort of engagement with the viewer. It has sort of encourages active way of looking. So once they know that some things are more obvious and they start seeing these things within the work, then they look for it in every work. And it may be in some works and it may not be, but they're always sort of looking for it. This is called The Wanderer. So, it's this anthropomorphization of the landscape where, because of the limitations of not using figures within the landscape, figures are these other sort of elements that are there. And then this is called The Journey. So as those mushrooms become the figure, then you have this landscape that's traversing across in this very slow way. This is be here now. In there. It takes, you have to kind of know where it is. But, this is like now. 3 feet by 2 feet. The crashing columns. So again, really utilizing this notion of moving through the landscape and going from day to night.
Rick, I'm curious about your impetus to put text in the work.
Well, it started with that idea of the sound.
Mm-hmm.
And then it made me realize that, well, it made me think about the classical Chinese paintings where, you'd have one artist who would paint a landscape, and then there'd often be another artist writing a poem over top.
Right.
So, there's this historical precedent of text being, right in the landscape, floating within.
Yeah, and the calligraphic text, the way you use
So
it.
drawing from that, it sort of felt like I was engaging in that.
That tradition. Okay.
Polaris. So this is within that. It's the North Star somewhere. And again, this is an in-situ shot in that gallery space. So the walls were sort of movable, so you kind of create a different exhibition each time. You could make the work read differently, and you could sort of guide the viewer in a particular way. So what I realized is that I was always sort of concentrating on this one sort of area of time, and it was sort of just moving from day to night. It was always sort of the day, and I was looking for ways to go beyond that, and I was fortunate in 2010 to have 2 simultaneous exhibitions at 2 different spaces. So this is that bunker space that Wendy was telling me about. It's this large sort of cavernous space, and this is probably the largest work we've done. This is 10 feet high by 12 feet wide. And it's based on this idea of time as place. So it's the in-between time. It's the gloaming. It's called the roaming gloom. So it's this idea of this place that keeps moving around through time that we experience over and over again in different places. And so this divide is sort of like that in between. In terms of that line down, it was a large diptych. And it was about twilight. And at the same time, I was showing in a gallery called the McClure, and that was all nocturne. So, the idea was that you would go to see this work first as going from a transition from day to night in that in-between time, and then moving to the other exhibition, which was completely nocturnes. So this is an in-situ shot. You can kind of get an idea of the scale of that space through that doorway on the left. So this next exhibition I was talking about was called The Wilderness, and it was this idea, like in Chinese painting, traditional Chinese painting, there's this heavy use of mist, where it's this sort of a contradiction, or this dialectic, say, between this God's eye view and having this, no singular perspective, but seeing this vast sort of space, and then half of it being obscured by mist. So it's like this between seeing everything and not being able to see anything. And in classical Chinese painting, that mist can symbolize not just the unseen or the unknown, but fundamentally the unknowable, that there's just some things that you just won't ever know. There's known knowns and unknown unknowns. So the idea was that for me, like, working with this sort of conversation between East and Western traditions, the romantic Western aspect, and that mist has become, in our modern world, which is increasingly being charted and mapped and known and revealed to us, that next great unknown is the darkness of space, our backyard, the Milky Way. So that's what the idea behind the title of The Wilderness was, exploring the unknown. So I wanted to do this show that was all nocturnes, all the landscape at night. But if anyone's ever been in the landscape at night, not near a city, you realize how dark it is. You can't see anything. The only thing you can see is from the light source, which is up in the sky. So it's all about the stars. So it starts off being standing on the surface and looking out. It's a familiar sort of things, gazing at the moon. These are ink, watercolor, and oil on linen. This is bleeding and staining the canvas, that sort of thing. Aurora Ursa looking through the veil. So even though these were all sort of spacescapes, I want to still create that sort of feeling of a viewer or a figure moving through this landscape or these spacescapes in the same way that you would move through the previous work. So this is Aurora Ursa, the northern lights through this veil, and that's the Big Dipper in the background. Watercolor, ink, oil on linen. Meteor storm. So it's the idea of us moving through space and interacting, colliding with other sort of elements of space. And Orion. So this is Orion's the hunter constellation. So it's like it's this figure in the landscape, the hunter in the landscape. And it's called Hixon Draconis. So it's which is here be dragons, which is often the part of ancient maps where they draw serpents and dragons and monsters and things where they, it was unknown territory. So anything could be out there. So this is this nebulous sort of nebula forming all sorts of things that using that gestalt in a more open way. Supernova, which is this idea of a star and its death, symbolizing death and rebirth. When the star explodes, the pieces of it become seeds for new stars. Again, these are all sort of watercolor ink on canvas. Omni, which is the infinite. They did this experiment where they pointed the camera at the darkest space, darkest spot in space, and every time the planet went back to that, revolved into that space, they would photograph it again and again and again, and the deeper they looked, the more they saw. It was just this infinite expanse of stars, and it just went on forever. So it's the infinite. So it's the idea of the divine. And the title of the work that the show is, this is a wilderness. It's our backyard. This is 4 feet by 8 feet. And Mystic Mountain. This is a nebula forming this mountain. It's sort of mythical sort of destination where we would find enlightenment if we journeyed there. These are 2 shots. So this next expedition is called Hybrid Vigor. And when I did this residency at Banff in 2009, I met another painter there, Paul Fortner. And he started up another gallery called Evans Contemporary, which another previous visiting artist has shown that recently. That was great to see that. But, he's a painter also, and when we did this residency together, he works in photographs, and he was taking these pictures in the mountains, and he was taking this picture of these people in a canoe in this lake at the bottom of the mountain. It was really beautiful work. And, he was really sort of upset by it because he thought it looked like a Peter Doig painting. If you're familiar with Peter Doig, he was a painter who became well known for painting canoes and iconic sort of Canadian images. And the canoe being one of them. And we had this long conversation about who owns those sort of cultural iconography. Like, can no one else paint a canoe now that Peter Doig became famous for it? And, long story short, it turned into this canoe trip. So he lives in Ontario, where the Group 7 works. He had a canoe. He's quite capable. So I found this good to go out and canoe all over Ontario with him. We went to wetlands, lakes, rivers, swamps. We were just driving along and saw a nice looking swamp. We would just stop the car and drop the canoe in. And after doing that for a couple of weeks, we went to the McMichaels Museum and saw all the Group 7's work. So we went out into the landscape via canoe and saw that landscape that the Group 7 painted. Then we saw the Group 7 works. And then we went home to our studios and we made works based on that experience. To try to take ownership over that experience. And so that's where this body work came from. But also, the idea of hybrid vigor is 2 separate things coming together and creating something new. This is something that we've done quite often in the human industry through breeding animals to create different kinds of animals, stronger or healthier or hardier animals, and things with crops as well. But it happens naturally in nature as well, such as lichen, which is something I'm particularly interested in, as it's like an algae or bacteria combined with fungus, which creates a whole new life form. So I was very interested in this idea of combining, using that as a metaphor, of combining all these disparate elements from all these different sources into these cohesive bodies of work. So this is called Twilight Dawn. So it could be more, more, could be evening, could be both. This is me in a canoe, because we did both the canoe paintings. So this is my canoe painting. So this is me moving, and this would be the canoe. Taking ownership over that. This is called Whispering Grass. Whispering Grass and Silent Water. This is 6 feet by 9 feet. My process is I'm a very lean painter, so I almost never use oil or medium. The only oil that's in this painting is as a binder with the paint itself right out of the tube. So what happens, I put on all these washes and all this thinner. I use a lot of thinners, go through a lot of brushes. But you get this very matte surface. And so once the paint's on there and all the thinner evaporates, all that's left is just the paint, nothing else on there. So it's very matte, it's very sort of watery. This is the Heart of Darkness, 6 feet by 5.5 feet. So using those sort of narratives within the idea of the river as this sort of journey towards, the subconscious, the inner realm. The singing tree. These are all birds that I saw on my trip. Not all together, but it's interesting, this idea of, I felt like a naturalist deliberately going out into a landscape and trying to memorize all these things and collect them in my memory to recreate them. And one of those naturalist sort of tropes was that we would combine all these things in these sort of particular way, like all the birds would be called an aviary and all the other kinds of animals would be a menagerie. So this was my aviary, and these are all birds that I saw on my trip. I actually saw more than I saw these. I was canoeing through the submerged forest, and there's all these massive black vultures staring at us. I didn't actually get to paint that, but it was quite an experience. This next one is called the menagerie. So it's the hybrid bigger part is it's part landscape, part turtle. This is the head here, and this is the back and the tail and the legs. And then here you have like snakes chasing frogs and things like that. Pink sky, so combining different kinds of light, like with a double rainbow, the sky is different in each stage, above, in the middle, and below. That pink sky would never exist without either of those rainbows. So just trying to think of these different ways that these two different sort of things happen. Lighting rainbow. Actually, I saw this in Montreal. It was quite stunning to see two of those phenomena in one moment. And this is called The Living Dead. And this is inspired by, it's like seeing this rotted out old stump, this dying thing that's been alive for centuries, and in its death, there's other things growing out of it. This continual life. It's never really dying, it's sort of living and it's dead. So it's based on the form of this zombie creeping up out of the ground, rolling tongue sort of thing. And I have a couple of details so you kind of can see the thinness and the scribbliness of the surface.
That black ink that you use?
I'm sorry?
In the drawing, are you using black paint or
I don't draw, I just start painting with blank canvas. I don't sketch anything, I just stand in front of the canvas, start painting. Whatever happens, happens. This is a model after that. So sometimes it's a very long process. Sometimes it takes a very long time to figure out what that painting is going to be. Sometimes it happens very quickly. This is called Foggy Fog. So becoming increasingly interested in this idea of obscuring elements of the landscape. This is the fog creeping in. Nightfall, I think this is the work that Wendy saw in Montreal.
Yes, it was.
Rick, are you mostly working from memory and impressions as opposed to any photographs you've taken, perhaps?
Yeah.
Wow.
Like an echo. And Midnight Gaze, so this is like, it's very subjective, increasingly interested in this idea of the subjectiveness of reading the landscape. So we're gazing at the stars and they seem like dripping jewels from the sky, and I'm interested in maybe being able to represent that sort of perception of that thing. So there's actually gems and jewels painted within the night sky. So this is brings me to this show that I had at AGGV that some of you may have seen. It's called Phenomenology of Dusk. So this started off as an experiment to combine my drawing practice and painting practice in a cohesive way, and it just sort of grew into this this body of work. And this is drawn. So this is drawn on panel and then painted with watercolors and then coated in resin and then oil paint and then resin and oil paint and resin and oil paint and so on and so forth. So it creates this sort of holographic look or this depth to it. And this body of work is really more of an investigation into that subjective realm, that sort of inner subconscious realm, but I wanted to use the language of the landscape because that's the language that I'm familiar with and that's what I know. And I found it interesting to sort of co-opt or use this language that was visual language that was used by, say, botanists or naturalists in the way that they describe something in the world in a very sort of meticulous and detailed way, but for something that was completely subjective. So it's this tension between, the subjective and the objective in that way, visually. So this is called hypnagogia. Hypnagogia is an actual physiological hallucination, a phenomenon that you can experience. It happens when you're in a state between sleep and waking and sleeping, and I've actually experienced it. And the more people I talk about it, that they realize that they've experienced it as well. So the interesting thing about this phenomenon is that everyone experiences the same hallucination, and that is you're awake in your body but you can't move. You feel like somebody's holding you down. And you feel like there's somebody in the room that you can't see watching you. And everyone hallucinates the same phenomenon. And I find it really interesting. When it happened to me, I thought it was like a ghost or something. Kind of freaked out. But then I realized later it was probably hypnagogia. So I was interested in this idea of hallucinations being felt on a bodily level, not just a psychological level. And so that was just my jumping in point in exploring this idea of using the phenomenology around dusk, or the time around dusk, as this metaphor to explore the phenomenology of being and being in the world, experiencing, sort of investigating perception, how we perceive things and internalize them and then manifest them. So this is my gateway. This is my sort of gateway to the realm between the conscious and subconscious. So you have the moth and the butterflies symbolize transformation from one thing to the other, one state to another, and you have these, as it gets darker, different forms sort of coming out of the landscape, like owls and bats. So I think you shot in that HGTV. This is a detail, so you kind of see the wood grain underneath. So, this would be watercolor, this would be oil. Constructing constraint, this idea that we manifest our own sort of rules around what's real and what's not real. All these sort of psychological constructs.
Sorry, can I ask a question? Are these butterflies also made up, or are you...
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes, they are. I looked at pictures, but I never brought any pictures into the studio.
No.
But I do things like, put little scribbles in the butterfly and create my own kind of thing. Once you get a general understanding of how those things are constructed, then you can sort of build them whatever you want. This is called oniric perception. And, looking at that sort of, researching that sort of visual language of the botanical language and the naturalist language, and learning about how things are titled with Latin and Greek, gave me an interest in the etymology of language and how those sort of titles come into being. And so I wanted to play with that sort of idea of the Grecian sort of roots and Latin roots of language. So the Oniric brothers are the three Greek gods who, when they manifest themselves, that when you're dreaming, you're manifesting those three Grecian gods of dreaming. So Phantasmus is when you're dreaming about, he represents inanimate objects like trees and rocks. Fogator manifests as creatures and animals, and when you dream of people, that's Morpheus. So in this, it's like on the shape of a head with a beard, and so that's Morpheus. And then it's made out of plants, stuffs, which is Phantasmus, and then it has this spider on it, which is Fogator. So it's this combination of this, like, how we construct our subconscious images in our minds. It was interesting, this idea of how this give and take, like projecting our psychology into the landscape through that gestalt, like ordering that chaos, and having influence our insight. So when we think of a place, we construct a landscape, within our minds. So it's all, I was very interested in this idea of this illusory sort of landscape space and how it's constructed. Another part of this is called The Abyss, and so in this exhibition, this work sort of came out of, I wanted to do something that was investigative of sublime, which is this idea that it's sort of terrifying and beautiful at the same time. And for me, I always had this sort of aversion to bugs and insects, and so that was my sort of terrifying element. And in this gallery space, I was fortunate that they had this little nook in the wall, and it just created this opportunity to create an installation. So we built this false wall, and in this false wall there was this hole about this big, and there was no markings around it, and it just basically rewarded the curious. If you were curious enough to look in this hole in the wall, you would see your own eye surrounded by an infinite expanse of insects. The way that this was done, yeah, but they were done in a sort of pretty way, so I don't think it was that terrifying. I tried. So this is a friend looking in the hall. It's very, it's very inconspicuous. But this is done on this side of the wall. It would be a drawing of the insects, and you'd be looking into a box of mirrors. So you'd be looking, everything would be reflecting that in a mise en abîme. So you basically see this, but refracted infinitely, and your eye would be right here.
Efren, do you want to speak of your experience looking at this? Did it change you forever?
Yeah. It was a life experience. Change.
So that's an in-situ shot of that body of work. And I was invited to show this work at a gallery up north, Two Rivers Gallery. And it was a much larger space, and I knew that I had to make much more work for that space. So I had an opportunity to expand this body of work, but at the same time I was invited to this residency in Halifax called the Isabel and Robert Pope residency. And so I had to pitch them, and I the residency culminated in an exhibition at the University Gallery there, and Anna Leonor's gallery, I think it's called. So I had to pitch them a whole sort of show, what I was going to be doing before I even got there. I knew what I was going to be doing. So what I pitched them is that it was an opportunity to do a show within a show, story within a story kind of thing. So the show that I pitched was called The Sublimation Self. So it's this idea that, playing with this idea that we're projecting, we're internalizing the outer realm and manifesting out again. So sort of in and out process. So one of the great things about this residency is it gave me access to facilities I didn't have before, such as printmaking. So this body of work still made the same process of laying down multiple layers of resin and paint, resin and paint. And but in a way, so this work was the base. It was a screen print. So I knew I wanted. The idea is a sublimation. So sublimation, for those who don't know, there's a couple of different definitions. One is this sort of skipping the process of going from, say, ice right into mist, and skipping the process of turning into water first. But it's also used in terms of transferring one sort of impulse into another impulse. So for activity. So say monks who have sworn a vow of celibacy, would transfer those sort of sexual urges into making champagne. So I thought it was a great sort of metaphor for the word to describe what artists do. We're sort of manifesting or sublimating these aspects of ourselves. So this particular work I wanted to do as a Rorschach or an ink blot because it's like a known sort of format in which people project themselves in their own gestalt and how they order and make sense of those ink blots and to make forms says a lot that they're projecting their own sort of personality into the work. So the sublimation self directly relates the process of the viewer sublimating aspects of themselves and looking at the Rorschach ink blot. But I still, for me, had to bring it into the language of the landscape. So for me, that was I had to look like a moth and a Rorschach. So the way that I did this is I made many ink blots, all different sizes. I scanned them into the computer individually, and then I arranged all these different ink blots into the shape that I wanted. And then I created a screen print and screen printed that image down on the panel, and then resin, and then started painting on top of that panel and resin, and going back and forth in that way. So this work wouldn't have happened if I wasn't able to go with that resin. So this is about 27.5 by 40 inches. This is a sublimation of desire. So in Asian symbology, the owl is a symbol of masculinity, and the peaches were a symbol of femininity. And so I wanted to create this something that was fundamentally human, so psychological. So it did, I didn't want to, by using the language of the landscape, it could have been just simply reproduction, and I didn't want to be about reproduction. It had to be something that was uniquely human, which is about desire and lust. So it was a sexual act represented through the language of the landscape. So the owls don't actually eat peaches. So it's this sort of way to draw you in. It's like there's something more going on, perhaps. This is about 36 inches by 50 inches. This is a sublimation spirit. This idea that a lot of my phenomenological sort of ideas are founded in Maurice Merleau-Ponty's sort of writings on phenomenology, and a large part of his writing is the idea of we are our bodies, our spirit, as we have, say, 175-pound soul. We are they're separate. So it's this sort of, is this soul versus spirit, separate, or is it connected? Is it coming or going? So the original draft of this was that this form was a mirror image of this, but it became too literal, so I deleted this one. So even though that these take a lot of planning and are really meticulous and tedious, there's still some room to dialogue a little bit. So when I went there, I don't know if any of you have traveled, but when you travel around the world, you get a messed up sense of time. And when I first moved there, I was waking up through the night, and instead of looking at the watch to see what time it was, I just look out at the sky and to see what time it was. So I had this epiphany that time, through the language of the landscape, is just the color of the sky. So I knew I couldn't do anything in the sky, because then it would just be a painting of clouds or the sun or the moon, but not have to just be the color of the sky. And it's a large part of what James Turrell works about. But that's, he's just opening holes in the ceiling and letting the light actually come in different shapes. And for me, it had to be about painting, had to be through the language of the landscape. So this was made with interference paint. So the thing with interference paint is that it's made with metal flakes, and where the light hits the metal flakes, it bounces off that color of the metal flakes, but where it doesn't bounce off, it goes through and lights up, becomes invisible and lights up the undercolor. So this is, when you are standing in front of this and you're walking by, it changes color as you move by it. So it changes color from pink to lavender. So it had to, not only did it have to be the color of the sky, but it had to be mutable too. It had to always be constantly changing. So the way that it was set up is that you'd walk in and enter on the left, or the right, I guess, the left, and towards this work, and as you walk towards it, the color changes. So a few times in the process of walking by it. So another opportunity I had in Halifax was I was able to work with a printmaker, Jessica Lofton, and she was a graduate student there, and together we made a lithograph. So I got to draw on stone. And it was a quite interesting process. And this is based on the idea of the narrative of it's a Taoist fable, and it's this Taoist priest who dreamt he was a butterfly, and the dream was so real that upon awakening he didn't know if he was a man who had dreamt he was a butterfly or a butterfly who was dreaming he was a man. And he realized that it didn't matter. It became this foundation for his philosophy, and that philosophy is called the transformation of things. It's about this state of being in between. So I thought it was this excellent sort of story that fit within what I was trying to do in terms of treading in between one realm and another. So it's in the shape of a face, and it's it's moth and face. It's kind of both ends. In the process of transforming. And when I was there, I was doing all these drawings. This is a drawing with just drawing from memory, just trying to invent forms and create things that seemed real. This is called mnemonic study. So this is all of this graphite on paper.
So the background is all graphite?
What it is, I drew it with graphite, drew the forms, and then I painted the black with acrylic paint with the binder being graphite.
Okay, so I was looking at it online, I was trying to figure out how it was made.
So it created this really matte sort of, great sort of black matte surface, but it's actually made with graphite pigment, like particles. So it is all graphite, with and the black is made with an acrylic binder.
Okay.
And in this exhibition up north, they didn't have a false wall for me to use, so I reworked this into a two-dimensional collage. It evolved. This is called Fade to Gray. This is 30 by 22 inches. So it became this meditative thing of just going deeper and deeper and more detailed and more detailed. But then the more I worked on it, the sort of grayer it became, and the more sort of harder it became to see. Even though I kept putting more and more information in, the more information I put in, the harder it became to see. So it became this sort of weird subliminal thing. So there's actually there's text in there as well.
Bert, is this a drawing or painting?
It's a drawing.
So it's graphite is the gray?
Yep, it's just graphite on paper. It's on gray paper. It's harder even. And this is called mesophic vision. This is 5 feet by 4 feet. So these are evening primroses, which are actually quite vivid yellow. So we have three types of vision. We have daytime vision, where we see in color, and we have nighttime vision, which is black and white. And then we have an in-between vision, mesophic vision, which occurs at dusk, when everything sort of turns to gray. That's called mesophic vision. It's actually something that's studied a lot by civil planners in terms of lighting the streets, and also museum people and how they light their exhibitions, how everything's sort of subdued. This would be mesophic vision, actually, sort of lighting. So this is sort of taking something that was really vivid green and vivid yellow and just desaturating and stripping away the color. So it was playing like with this idea of actual phenomena that happen at dusk, and then using that dusk as a metaphor to talk about things that were actually more sort of interior and subjective. So it's just a play between the outer and the inner and the real and unreal. And this is it's really small in-situ shot of that show up north. And I did that show this last spring. And that's about it.
Thank you.